Hello again, good to see you back. I'm going to play a quick 10-minute game. I've just been watching the opening ceremony of the Tokyo Olympic Games, so I'm looking forward to watching as many diverse sports as possible. And I'm playing actually an opponent from India who is rated just a little bit higher than me, so it should be a nice game. And I've got the black pieces. Let's see how it goes. Okay, well, e4, I'm just going to play the French defence. Yeah, now, I see this move quite often online. It's a way that White tries to avoid any French theory, but I can just play my normal stuff here for a while. And I'm just going to capture back with a pawn. And actually, if White was to play d4 here, we're back in the exchange French, which, as I explained the other day, does have an undeserved reputation, in my opinion, of being quite boring. But in fact, I think players of the white pieces expect that, and they don't expect any sort of tactics to appear, which quite often can come. Oh, but my opponent has avoided that anyway, and in fact, he will never play d4 now, or not for a long time, because I'm going to play d4 myself. And I think this is a good move. It stops his knight coming to c3, which is where he wants to put the knight. And it stops d4, which means that his white squared bishop, his light squared bishop on f1, doesn't have that many good places to move to. d3 seems sensible. It opens up for his dark squared bishop to come out. And I'm just going to develop and add another piece of protection to that advanced pawn on d5. So I'm going to play knight c6 here. And again, my opponent can develop his knight to d2 now, but it does mean that it's quite a slow build-up. Let's see what he does. He's thinking about this, so he must be... Okay, so bishop e2, that looks sensible. He's going for quick kingside development, and I know now that his king is going to be castling probably next move. Although I can stop him castling. I probably should just play bishop d6 here, but I'm going to try and misplace one of his pieces. So I throw in the check, and then I can drop back to d6, depending on which piece he puts on to d2. He can obviously move the king to... I wasn't thinking he can move the king to f1, but then he can't castle. Okay, well, I'm going to go back to d6, and you might think I've wasted a tempo, and quite possibly I have. But really, I think White needed to keep the d2 square for his knight, because the knight on b1 is going to struggle to get into the game. Okay, so that's an interesting move. I'm just going to continue to... Oh, I was going to develop a piece, but I think I'll play h6 because it stops any nastiness that might occur from a knight or a bishop landed on this square, on my g5 square. Okay, and I've also, I can play g5 at some stage, and I'm thinking about castling queenside. Okay, this looks a bit, well, I mean, the idea is if it's White's move here, he can take the pawn on d4 because my knight is pinned. But even that idea, it's flawed a little, because if the knight was to take on d4, I can capture this pawn on h2 with a check, and then my queen will be free to capture the knight. I must actually learn how to draw arrows. I think I'll try and do that before the next video, and it'll make explaining my plans easier to understand. But I'm just going to move my bishop, develop a bishop, and break the pin on the knight. And of course, now if I move the knight, I'm threatening the white queen. So my opponent moves the queen back straight away. Now he could have gone to that square in one go, which meant if my opponent had played the queen to c2 and I had played bishop to d7, it would now be my opponent's move. But I've gained a tempo, and I'm going to play, I think I'm going to try and hit out at the king side. So my threat here is to force the knight back just simply by advancing the pawn another square, and the knight's only retreat square is to go back to e1, a square that he really wants to put his rook onto. So let's carry on with that. And of course, if my opponent plays rook e1 now, which he would like to do, having it would be opposite my king. So just carrying on that comment, my opponent would have liked his rook on e1, but that would have meant the knight would have no squares to move to. Now I'm going to play a risky move here. I'm not sure it's the best move, but I'm going to play my queen here. Attacks the bishop, and my opponent will play rook e1 next move. In fact, he's played it immediately. And now this looks very dangerous for me because the white rook on e1, my queen and my king are all on the same file. So there is a danger of me losing the queen if his bishop was to drop back to f1, for example. However, I can avoid the pin by castling. And by castling, we're going to have our kings on opposite sides. And that pretty much guarantees a bit of a nasty and bloodthirsty game. So let's go for it. Even if I lose this game, it's going to be exciting. Now a3, that probably is another waste of a tempo. And there's a couple of reasons I don't think that's a good move. One is that the knight wanted to go there. And the other reason is it might have been worthwhile just sacrificing the b pawn by playing b4 immediately, just to open up the b file. But I'm going to ignore the queen side because I think my attack on the king side is much quicker, and my bishops on d6 and d7 point towards the white king, whereas my opponent's bishops on e2 and d2 aren't looking at my king. So I think I've got an advantage here. So I'm going to play f5 just with the idea of pushing g5 next move. Okay, so we do have a pawn race here, but for the reasons I explained, I do think I stand a bit better here. Because the point now is that either the g file is going to be semi-opened, well, in fact, or if my opponent captures with his pawn and I capture back, then the white knight has to move. I've got quite a big initiative and I can get my pieces very quickly to the king side. Okay, so now we're having to start calculating a bit more thoroughly. We both have our knights under attack. Which I'm not going to calculate this too much, which doesn't sound very good, but it is only a 10-minute game, so I'm just going to take my opponent's knight and see what he does. If he takes my knight, then I can take back with the bishop, and I am already then threatening to capture something on the king side. I've also got queen g2, which queen g7, looking at the pawn on g2. Okay, so my opponent has sacrificed a piece, at least on a temporary measure, because I've captured his knight, but my knight can now move to e5, and I think I should just play that and not worry too much about what's going to happen next, because I'm a piece up and I have opened up the g file. So I'm going to play this move, and obviously that my knight again is pinned to the rook. However, I am threatening to take the bishop, so I think his bishop on f3 has to move, because if I take it, it's check, which will give me an extra move. And I've also got queen g7, which is a nice move. Okay, so I mean queen g7 here, and I'm just a piece up, and I've still got a strong attack. But I am Oh, I don't know. I mean, Queen G7 is probably the move that I would play if I spent longer thinking about this. But I just feel I should be developing my last piece, get it into the game. So let's play this move. I know my opponent can play F4, and there you go. So the knight on E5 now can't move. Well, it can move, obviously, but my queen will then get captured by the rook. But I'm still confident that. Okay, so this is getting very complicated now. What I'm looking at is if my opponent captures, well, he's going to capture one of the knights, but if he captures the knight on E5, then I'm going to play my other knight to E3, attacking the queen. This all gets I'll try and calculate it. Obviously, this does depend on what my opponent's done this, so perhaps I should try and calculate this now rather than just make the move and then do it. But my idea was knight goes to E3. If he captures my bishop by taking the bishop on D6, I capture my opponent's queen, which also forks both rooks. Pawn can then take the queen, but I think I can play rook to E8, blocking the pawn on E7, and I'm still forking both rooks. So let's go for that. It looks exciting. And if my opponent takes on E3 here, then I'm just going to capture. But if he takes it with the rook, I should capture the rook. If he takes with the bishop, I think I can even take on E5 with the queen, because I'm also threatening queen H2 then. So this looks very strong for me. But I think the toughest move here would be if my opponent takes my bishop with his pawn, and then I said pawn takes bishop, knight takes queen, pawn takes queen, rook to E8, and I'm forking both rooks. And I think I'm just much better in that position. Oh, okay. Well, I think that was good calculation. However, my opponent has just moved his queen, so my next move is I'm just going to capture the pawn on E5, and I think I'm standing much better. I'm not concerned at all about the queen taking on A7 because my king is perfectly safe, even though it looks a bit risky. I don't think there's any danger in this, and in fact, queen takes A7 now. I can deliver checkmate by. Let me show you. If the queen was to take here, I can move my queen down here, which is check, and then I capture the pawn because I'm defended by the knight. So my opponent can't take there. So he probably has to capture my knight. And if, okay, well, he's taken the knight. I don't have to think about this. I can just recapture that. And I've got threats on every side of the board. I still have the threat of queen to h2 check. I'm also threatening to take the rook on a1. So I think I'm going to win this game. Okay, well, obviously, if I took the rook on a1 now, that would be pretty disastrous because I'd win a rook, but queen a8 is checkmate in this position because my king is completely boxed in. But as I said, I'm not concerned about this position because I can make a safe haven for my king. In fact, if I move the c-pawn, I can just block the check with my bishop, and I'm still threatening queen to h2 and queen takes a1. So let's move the pawn. I think I'll move the pawn 2 squares, although probably it doesn't make any difference if I move the pawn to c6 or to c5. Okay, and as I said, now if my opponent checks, the bishop just comes back to b8, and the queen's out of play, and I'm threatening everything. Right, okay, well, this is a disastrous move from my opponent because I'm going to capture with the bishop, which means that I'm threatening the rook on a1 still, but I'm also now threatening checkmate just with moving my queen to h2 and then taking on g2. So this move's straightforward for me. And my opponent has to do something to prevent the checkmate. Probably the best reply here would be to play rook to a2, which moves the rook from a1 where I can capture it, and also the rook would defend the pawn on g2. And if my opponent does do that, I will probably play rook to g8, renewing the threat. So let's see if he plays the expected rook a2. No, I think my opponent's given up. Now I've got all sorts of moves I can play here. I can just take the knight, but as I pointed out earlier, I've got checkmate in 2 moves. So let's finish the game. Now my opponent's thinking about this, but he actually only has 1 square. And there we go, checkmate. Well, it was a nice victory. My opponent could have played the game much better, to be honest with you. But another French defence that proves that you don't have to have boring games when you play the exchange French. And now I can get back to watching the Olympic Games. Apparently, it's going to be the hottest Olympic Games ever. Well, I suggest they get more fans in the stadiums then. Okay, see you next game. Thank you and goodbye.